Hello everyone, I'm Priyanka Patki. I'm the co-founder of Snout Scout the Dog Family. Today we have the second live chat of our series, The Pawfect Guide. Our guest of honor for today is Jerry Bradshaw. He has inspired so many of us in this field of dog training and dog sports. The reason we have our first sport in India is all thanks to him, which is PSA. So, hi Jerry, how are
Hi,
you doing?
hi Priya. Nice to see you.
How are you doing? How has the lockdown been for you?
Not too bad. We're staying busy. We've got a lot of police dogs and military dogs that we're currently training, so we're busy with that. And our school, since beginning of last month, has pretty much reopened full scale. So we've been busy trying to make catch up a little bit from the last few months, as well as move forward. So we're doing okay. I appreciate the opportunity to come on with you and talk with you.
Thank you so much. It's an honor for us, Jerry. And I know you've been so busy and you still agreed to do this. So it's really, we are grateful that, you could be on board for this.
So anything for you guys.
Thank
My PSA family over in India has always had a special place in my heart. We've visited there quite a few times. So miss you
Absolutely.
guys. I haven't seen you in a couple of years, so it was easy for me to say yes.
Okay. So, everyone, so today our topic of discussion is going to be aggression. Aggression mainly in first, we're going to start with a few questions on aggression in pet dogs and how do we tackle it. And moving on, we are going to go to the sport, to PSA, and we will take up a few questions on decoying and any questions related to that. Yeah. So to start with, I want to first ask you the first question is that, a lot of times pet parents are really scared about the entire, the topic aggression,
Hmm.
right? But they are willing to take the necessary precautions so that they can prevent it from happening. So would you like to give some tips for such pet parents who are willing to go and take all the efforts so that it does not happen?
Sure. I think as a trainer, talking with folks that have dogs that have aggression problems. First thing you have to realize is that aggression in an animal, like a dog, is a natural behavior. Um, it's nothing to necessarily be scared of, but I like to liken it to electricity. You have to have a certain respect for the aggression as well. Most dogs are not looking to hurt anybody, and I think we have to look at each case on its individual merits. We have to be careful not to make sweeping generalizations about aggression. We have to remember that aggression is one way in which dogs communicate. So, for example, when we are, if a dog growls, for example, I think a lot of people overreact to that behavior in general because it's scary. It's viscerally scary for a human being to get growled at or be on the receiving end of aggression in whatever form it takes. And so, but your dog can't send you a memo or an email to let you know what they don't like. And so it's part of their ability to communicate with intra species as well as interspecies. And so we have to be able to understand what's being communicated when we see aggression, not overreact to it, and try and understand how we can actually show the dog what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and that's what we're here for as trainers, right? Our job is to guide folks through that situation when they encounter these things, whether it's a dog that might growl. I've had situations where a 6-month-old puppy growls a little bit over a possession or something like that. And when you catch these behaviors early, oftentimes we can have a lot of effect on them. But they're going to be exploring these behaviors sometimes, and for the most part, most of what we're going to see in pet dogs is not going to be tremendously severe. However, we have to be careful not to allow these behaviors to go on too long unchecked, make excuses for it, or something like that. So I think it's important that
Absolutely.
when people start to see behaviors that they find uncomfortable, aggressive behaviors that they might find uncomfortable, that they seek out help from professionals so that they can, number one, understand and classify what's going on, and then number two, be able to take some steps to address those behaviors. But the biggest thing I think I can relate a story here from when I first got my first dog ever. I was a graduate student. I was in my early 30s, and she was a little mixed breed. And I remember taking her to the lake for a swim, and she came upon like a little. I guess somebody had been fishing and dropped a little small fish on the side of the lake. And she picked up the fish in her mouth, which I thought was quite disgusting, to be honest with you. And I went to try and get it away from her. And for the first time in my relationship with this puppy, since I had her at probably about 12 weeks old, she started growling at me over the fish that was in her mouth and scared me. I mean, things started going through my head as a pet owner. I wasn't a trainer yet, and as a pet owner, I was worried about, is this dog going to bite me? Is it going to, the potential for aggression is there? Is it going to maybe bite somebody else, or am I going to have to put my dog down? All these thoughts were going through my head. It was very scary at the time. And so I remember feeling those feelings that pet parents feel when these things happen. And I immediately went, and my dog was in a puppy class at the time, and I immediately went to my trainer and shared with him all my grave concerns about the relationship and what might happen in the future. And he was able to calm me down. He said, "Look, this is not as big a deal as you're making of it. Let's work on it. Let's talk about it." And he gave me some remediation steps. And the dog had great what we call bite inhibition, right? So it wasn't something I really had to worry about. She was a little vocal at times when she got a possession, but it never went any further than that. And I think it's important to have dogs looked at by professionals so that they can tell you really, whether you have a problem or you don't have a big problem. Um,
Right, right. Absolutely. Jerry, one more thing that you just said that happened with your dog. So, that is a concern for a few pet owners is once they pick up something and then when they go to bring it, get it out of the mouth, that is
right.
when a lot of times bites are happening.
Right.
So, do you have some tips for that? Like, what should they do in a situation like that?
Oh, for sure. I think as we're, the first thing, and you know this, Priya, as well as I do, the earlier the pet parents bring the puppies to us, the easier it is for us to shape great behavior for the rest of that dog's life, right? So we always want people to come to us before the problems blossom into something worse. Get those puppies in for puppy training, puppy classes, and so early intervention is super important. Even if you don't have, and I think this is a big thing that you probably preach to your pet parents as well, but even if you don't have any problems per se, it's important to lay good communication foundation with your puppies, with your young dogs. And so obedience training is essential. And there's so many things in those classes when they come to you that you can teach them about prevention of problems. When you have a dog that learns, he doesn't own possessions, he just borrows them for a little while, right? And you ultimately are the owner of all the possessions, and he has to give them back to you. But you're pretty liberal with the rent. You know what I mean? Like you'll rent those things out. You'll rent the toys out to them for periods of time so they can enjoy them. But ultimately, they're your toys. And once they understand that that's the relationship there, it's much easier to teach the dog to take something, to give it back. And we have a process for teaching dogs to give us things back if we start with lower value items that they might possess, and we teach them to give them up in exchange for a food reward or something like that. There's so much that we can do early on to teach those dogs to not be possessive. Same thing with food bowls and other higher value items. We can teach them that it's okay for us to put our fingers in their food bowls. We're going to bring high value items to the party. We're going to maybe give them something even better than the kibble that might be in their food when we touch the food bowl. We do it with the children in the household. So the dogs become habituated to the reaching for the food bowls, the moving of it around, to the point where you should be able, with your young dogs, to be able to put your hands right in the bowl, take food out, put it back in, and they should be okay with that. But these are things that we can do with this early intervention. If we don't have a problem to start with, it's much easier for us to kind of guard against the appearance of those problems. We have to remember, as these dogs go through different stages of life, from puppyhood to adolescence to adulthood, how they interact with their environment is going to change based on their genetics. And we want to intervene as quickly as we possibly can to lay the best foundation. A dog that we can communicate with effectively with obedience training, and we can put some behavioral training on that dog early on, so that we can prevent the most common problems, make for a much better relationship down the road, and hopefully, as that dog matures, the habits will be set where the dog is going to give us good behavior, that we can focus on rewarding good behavior rather than constantly focus on what do I do with this bad behavior. If we don't allow it to come up, it's a much easier situation.
Absolutely. Right. Right. So, does food aggression also, is it a lot to do with genetics?
Yes, in my experience, a lot of the dogs that we see that have that problem, there's, for most behaviors, there's always a genetic component to it, and then there's a learned component to it. And I think, um, through no fault of their own, some owners and pet parents will have the appearance of this as the dog starts to mature from puppyhood to adolescence. The dog is, they're like, sometimes they're like teenagers. They try out certain types of behaviors. You can have the perfect little puppy, and then as he starts to come into adolescence, the genetics start to show themselves a little bit in that way, and so you might, out of the what you think is out of the blue, start to experience some of that type of behavior, where the dog might growl over its food bowl, or if you are in the habit when it's a puppy of giving it real bones, like meat bones or something like that. You might find that one day the dog decides, I want to keep this. I don't want you to take it away. Um, and so, yes, I think genetics is a huge component of what we see behaviorally. Um, if you're adopting older dogs, sometimes when you take a snapshot of how that dog behaves around resources, you don't necessarily know if that was a learned behavior or if that was a genetic behavior. And so we have to take what we're given, and start to experiment with ways in which we can start to mitigate or eliminate those behaviors. And if we have good techniques, and much of the behavior is learned behavior, a lot of times we can suppress, mitigate, make better, teach the dog that there are other ways to interact over these types of situations. And again, you may have some dogs that, no matter what you do, when you reach for their food bowl, they might give you a little growl, but it never goes beyond that, right? And so some of that genetic programming might stick around for a little while, but we also have to make sure that what we're seeing is something that we can work with. And again, the earlier we get them in, the better it is. But if we do get older dogs in with these problems, we do have some tried and true techniques that we can use to work on them, and
Right.
in most cases make them quite a bit better. Working dogs will always work to find their advantage in situations. And if we can make it to their advantage to not guard their food, to not be overly possessive of toys, we can oftentimes make really great inroads into any of those problems.
Right. Makes sense. Great. That's really helpful, Jerry. Really.
Mhm.
I have another question. So there's a lot of information on the internet, about a dog being dominant,
Yes.
and hence he doesn't let another person come close to his sleeping area, or all of that. There's a lot of such information, and pet parents do come to us with these questions. What would you like to tell them about dominance in general? Like, what does dominance always have something to do with aggression? Is it such a bad thing? Does that really have something to do with the sleeping area aggression? Or is it just a dog getting startled? What is it? Like, can you help us a little bit on that front?
Sure. Any type of resource guarding, whether it's preferred sleeping places, food, high value items like toys, meat bones, rawhide bones, things of that nature. We use dominance, sort of a model that we use, right? So when we're trying to communicate with owners or pet parents about these types of things, the dominance model is something that most owners kind of naturally understand. If you watch any shows on TV about wildlife, you can kind of see the pack dynamics in wolf packs that people talk about, and so forth and so on. How accurate that model is from top to bottom, it's hard to say. But at the same time, it's a useful model for us to understand what we're seeing. And so I use that model because I think it's very easy to communicate that model to dog owners. Um, and I like to talk to dog owners and say, look, if you see a group of dogs together, they do interact in sort of a hierarchical fashion. Um, there are rules and regulations about those interactions that they establish on their own. And the thing is, they can't draw up a constitution about how they're going to get along in the house as human beings could, right? We can write a document and say these are the rules of how we interact. Those rules are sort of learned on the go, by the dogs in the group that you might be watching. And so, in the animal world, might makes right. And so, if the big strong dog has the bone, he can usually convince the other members of that social group to stay away from his stuff. And we look at that and we say, well, he's showing dominance behavior. When those behaviors get shown to us as human beings, they become a little bit worrisome, because we don't want the dog deciding where he gets to sleep and if we get to sleep nearby, or if we walk by and touch him while he's sleeping, that he gets to show aggression to us or anything like that. So using that dominance model to understand what we're looking at, if we see things like the dog is growling us off of his possessions or doesn't like to be disturbed when he's on a sleeping place, that's showing us that that dog is interacting in a way that we're really not prepared to tolerate as humans in the equation. So I usually tell people your goal is not to become the most dominant dog in the pack, because number one, you're not a dog, and number two, you don't want to work out those disagreements the way dogs do. Dogs work those disagreements out with aggression, displays of aggression, physical displays, where they might put their paws up on the other dog's back. They might actually fight with them in an inhibited way. But at the same time, we don't want to interact with them that way. And so we use our abilities, our cognitive abilities, and we use our abilities to teach the dogs obedience. We use our ability to modify behavior to interact with them, sort of as what I call a super alpha, where we want to be in the equation sort of as the god in the equation, if you will, where we don't want to interact on their level. So we do the training, and this is where again the trainers are so important in guiding people through these situations. The training allows us to manipulate behavior without being physical. It allows us. We don't have to growl at the dogs. So
I was just going to ask you that. Yeah.
right. Like you get some old school trainers that will want you to behave as if you're a dog, and when you're dealing with a puppy, if you're going to the old school of alpha rolling the puppy and holding it down on its back and picking it up and looming over it and things like that. When you have an 8-week-old small puppy, that's easy to do, but eventually that puppy grows into a full-grown dog. And you don't want to be wrestling around on the floor, trying to alpha roll your Cane Corso when he weighs 150 pounds, right? So we want to interact in a way in which we can still get the idea across that we control all the resources. We have the thumbs, we have the debit cards, the cash, right? So they can't go out to the store and buy their own groceries and come home and hold court in our homes, right? So we have all the resources. We have the ability to intervene with their behaviors. Once they understand how to interact with us through obedience, we can then start showing them, here's what you must do in order to get what you want. Everything comes through us. And so, in a sense, when we talk about dominance, basically what we're trying to do is set up a system of permission where we give the dog permission to have things like we were talking about earlier with the toys. They get to rent things from us. They don't get to own them. So
Absolutely.
they get to borrow the toys for a little while. They get to play with them, but ultimately they must be able to give them back to us. And that's what we do through training. And I'm sure you stress this with your pet parents as well. That it's not just sit down, stay, come, heal. It's how you use those behaviors every day. All right. Um, making sure the dog understands place commands, making sure the dog understands how we want them to approach us, not jumping all over us, and so forth. But we use the behaviors to teach them how we want them to behave and interact. And again, I keep going back to it, but it's so important to do this when they're young, because then you establish a way of interacting with the humans in the household that the dog, number one, understands very well, and number two, it really is shaped to how we prefer things, right? We may find some dog owners that don't necessarily want to have their dogs up on the furniture or anything like that. We would typically tell them, don't do those sorts of things. Don't let them sleep in the bed. Don't let them be up high in the furniture with you, things of that nature. But once you know your dog, I know I'm a little more permissive about some of those things with my dog.
Same.
You sort of figure out, right, what's okay for that dog. And I think that's where the trainers come in, where you can say, look, with this dog, we want to be very careful about not giving any mixed signals about who's in charge of anything. And you may find other dogs that are much more middle pack ranking, to lower ranking dogs in any sort of relationship, where they can have a little bit more freedom to maybe not follow as strict of a rule set. But ultimately, it comes down to that particular dog and what rules we really feel like that dog needs to follow in order to be a successful part of the household.
Correct, correct. Really makes sense. Yes, absolutely. Jerry, I wanted to ask you another question about. So there is a lot going on about crate training in India. Okay, it's pretty much a new concept. Yeah,
Right,
I know, like all of you have been crate training forever, but
right.
here it's a big, it's a big no-no. People start thinking that you're going to take away the freedom of the dog. So
Hmm.
can you please? Or the worst thing is that sometimes there is this entire belief, I would say,
Hmm.
that creating is what is causing aggression.
Ooh,
Can
okay.
you please can you please tell us a little bit about that? Can you please tell the pet parents a little bit about that?
Sure. I think one of the things that we all know from raising human beings, right, is that we restrict their freedom when they're young. It's something that we do. You let your toddler have free run of the neighborhood. They might toddle out into the road. They will put themselves in positions where they hurt themselves because they don't understand their environment. And I think it's important for us as trainers, pet parents, to really understand that in the beginning, when we're creating dogs, we are trying to sort of shape their behavior with the wider world. Um, in a more natural environment rather than a suburban or an urban environment, an animal would roam large amounts of territory where they would be safe necessarily. And so roaming around the woods is one thing, but if you live on a busy intersection, you can't allow that dog the freedom to just roam around. They might get hit by a car. They might interact with other dogs that might not be as well behaved. They might learn some bad behaviors. So there's danger lurking around every corner when you're raising a puppy until they really learn what their responsibilities are and how to behave in the greater world. So we use confinement as a way when we don't have the ability to be teaching that dog what he's supposed to be doing to keep him safe. And so I think crate training, number one, for house training is probably the easiest and most effective way to do that. Most young dogs, especially from puppyhood, they need to sleep quite a bit, and we forget that they don't have to be up and interacting all the time. The other thing is we want to teach them independence, and so when I crate my dogs, I put them not necessarily right in my bedroom or right in the family room. I'll put them in a room a little bit far away, so they learn to be able to entertain themselves. Give them maybe a toy to play with in the crate, so they learn that it's okay to be away from us. That helps us not create, let's say, separation anxiety, which is a big problem with a lot of dogs when they start interacting and they're with you all the time. And like with separation anxiety, for example, that's a natural behavior for a pack animal, right? They need a way for nature to communicate to them. Don't get separated from the pack. If you are a pack animal and you get separated from the pack out in the woods, let's say, you're probably not going to survive. And
Yeah.
so the genetics provides a way for that dog to imprint and bond with the group where they don't ever want to be away from the group. That doesn't serve us very well when we have to go to work, and we want the dog to feel calm and comfortable when they're away from us. We have to teach independence to these dogs, and the crate is a great way to teach independence in the beginning. I always tell people dogs have to earn their freedom. Um, and
Right.
we can create them early on to teach the house training behaviors, to teach independence, to teach those dogs to be able to interact with the world properly. Because if we're not there to supervise their interactions, oftentimes they'll decide that your pillows on your couch are a great toy to play with if you're not in the living room with them. And then now you've allowed them to learn a bad behavior because you weren't able to supervise them at the moment. Um,
Right.
I always try and tell pet owners, when they say to me, well, the dog should be able to be free, he shouldn't have to be confined. And I say, there's no shoulds in dog training. There only is what is, right? And if we allow that dog to learn behaviors that are incompatible with our way of living, then we're in trouble. And that's the thing. These dogs are not living out in the woods. They're living in a home. And we have rules, whether we realize it or not, about how we want that dog to interact in our home, how we want them to behave around our things, around our stuff. They don't
Right.
have any sense of that, that quilt that your grandmother made for you is sentimental. And so if they decide to drag it off the couch and rip it up and sleep in it, they don't know that that's wrong to do. If they were out in the wild, there would be no rules about that sort of stuff. And so I think when we realize, hey, we have rules about how we want that dog to behave, that confinement allows us to guide that dog over a period of time. And as they get better about how they behave in the house, when we take them for walks, when we take them to the park and so forth, they earn more freedom over a period of time. And it doesn't take very long for that dog to be able to earn a pretty good amount of freedom, considering that we still have to protect them in our society. So I think it's when we look at it that way, it makes a little bit more sense, and
Right.
we don't want to anthropomorphize too much, right? I think a lot of pet owners have a tendency to think, well, I wouldn't want to be stuck in that crate, and yes, that's true. But as an animal trying to live in our society, we have to be fair to them, because let's be fair. If we don't teach them how we want them to interact, if we give them too much freedom too fast, they make too many mistakes, which in their mind is not really a mistake. If they want a sleeping place and they decide they're going to sleep on the couch, that's fine. If they don't get to go outside, and they have free run of the house and decide, well, I'll just go in the back bedroom and lift my leg, we're going to have a problem with that. If the dog understands what the rules are and we use the confinement properly, but also it's very important not to confine the dog so much that we use the crate as a babysitter. When you take on the responsibility of having a dog, you're responsible for interaction with that animal. You're responsible for giving it play. You're responsible for giving it food, companionship, all of those things. And it's a time consuming thing, right? So we
Right.
don't want to leave the dog to their own devices, yet they shouldn't so much that they never get interaction. And that's when it becomes unfair to the dog. So
Correct.
the more you spend structured, proper time with the dog, the better it's going to be for them. But when you can't do those things because of our modern society, you have to work sometimes. Sometimes there's not somebody there to interact with the dog. It's better to keep them out of trouble, and that's really
Correct.
what the crate
Correct.
represents for us. It's a training tool, and over time we eliminate that. you know as well as I do that many dogs actually like their crate.
Absolutely.
If it's a busy household, let's say you have a lot of kids in the household, and they annoy the dog all the time, right? If the dog has a place where he can go into his crate sometimes to have
Right.
some quiet time, it's good. Just like mom and dad need some quiet
Right.
time sometimes, right? Where you can
Right.
get away from everything. The dog
Right.
also needs some quiet time. If we teach him that that is a safe place, maybe he even gets fed in there, but he can go there and seek some refuge occasionally. It's actually a very positive thing for the dog. Dogs are den animals, right? And so curling up in a small space is not a bad thing to a dog. But we don't want to use it as punishment. We don't want to. It's not jail when they're bad. It's a training tool for house training and for independence training, and also to teach that dog the behaviors that we want. If we, you know as well as I do that as trainers, we want to focus on good behavior. We want to focus on
Absolutely.
rewarding good behavior. We don't want to spend too much time teaching the dog how to not be bad.
Yes.
We want to teach them, hey, when I'm supervising you, I'm going to give you all these behaviors that you can engage in that are good, that bring reward, and that's a much better way to interact with the dog. So if we can't watch them, if we can't be vigilant with them, the crate is a great way for him to not get himself into trouble.
Correct, absolutely. And the crate is nowhere creating aggression, right? Otherwise, people like us would have no job to do because
Exactly
you're
right.
spending all your time creating aggression. So, if it was that simple, you would have just put a dog in the crate, right?
Exactly. And I think sometimes what people see is, when they start the independence training with a young dog, they don't like it, right? The puppies, if they're in a litter and they're with their siblings and their mother and so forth, they're constantly together. It's what I was talking about before. And then as you sort of separate them and say, okay, now you have to learn to live in a human household, right? And we teach you do the independence training. We put them away and they're inside there, and maybe they're barking or so forth. I think people misinterpret that behavior. That may signal a little bit of anxiety, but that's part of the independence process, right? The same thing happens. I think people forget when you take your child for the first time to kindergarten. Most of the time, they're not thrilled about being left when you take them away from home and you drop them off with new children and a new teacher. Sometimes the children will cry and it takes them a little while to adjust to the new environment. And then they realize, oh, when I come here, I learn things, and my teacher is very nice to me, and I get to interact with these other children. Then after a while, they start to like school. But the first day, it usually doesn't happen that way. Just like the first day you put the dog in the crate, he's not going to be thrilled about being maybe away from you and separated. But that's an essential part of that dog learning to be independent. And just as we send our children to school, it's essential for them to learn that independence,
Right.
them to be around other people, to be able to interact. And when we create our dogs, and in the beginning, we're teaching them that independence. And it's very important for them to experience that. It is a little, it's a little unnerving sometimes. Some people are extremely empathetic with their dogs, and so they feel like, oh, I'm causing him distress because he's in the crate and he's crying and so forth. Oh, you kind of have to allow that dog to learn to adapt to that new environment. And
Right.
what's the worst thing you can do? Put them in there, let them like bark and whine and so forth, and then in the middle of that, open the crate up and let them out. Then they learn, oh, when I bark in the crate and when I whine in the crate, that is the route for me
That's
to get
it.
out. So you have to stay strong when you're doing the independence training in the beginning and you're doing the house training. Stay strong and let the dog out when he's quiet. Let the dog out when he starts to settle down, and then you won't have problems with the crate later on. But
Right. Right.
I think too many people try and attach human characteristics and human emotions to what the dogs are going through. And yeah, we want to be kind to our dogs, but I think the kindest thing we can do for dogs is teach them how to interact anxiety free and independently and so forth. The same goals you might have for a child. You want them to be out in the world and be confident and independent and be able to act on their own, so that when they become adults, they're not constantly under stress. The same thing for dogs. We want them to learn those behaviors so that they can be sort of better canine citizens as they grow older.
Right, perfect. Thanks, Jerry. I'm going to really make everyone listen to that part, whoever is even not here today. Okay, let's take a few questions from the audience. So here Aishwarya is asking, in puppies, what could be some signs which would help point out if it is genetic aggression versus learned aggression?
When we're dealing with puppies, it's not really all that important to know the difference. And sometimes you can't. Anytime you look at a dog, you're taking a snapshot in time of that dog's behavior. Some of that behavior will be learned, and some of it will be genetic. If you're a good dog trainer and you ask the right questions, oftentimes you can see how much of a particular behavior might have been created based on how the pet parents are interacting with the puppy or young dog, right? If you're busy interacting with that dog in ways in which you're probably creating some of those bad behaviors, and we can, as trainers, we can ask you the right questions to figure that out. Then we can, well, maybe most of this behavior is learned. When I talk to a pet parent and I ask them those questions, how they interact with their dogs, and they tell me they're basically doing right. They're doing all the right things that we would expect, and yet some aggression, then we might make the assumption that most of that aggression might be coming out sort of as an expression of genetics. Either way, our approach is the same, right? We have to decide how we're going to work on that problem. And whether it's a bit genetic or there's a learned component to it, we're going to approach it the same. I always tell people, when we have aggression problems in dogs, whether some of it is genetic or some of it is learned, our approach is the same. It's kind of like a doctor telling you that he has to do exploratory surgery. I'm not going to know exactly the extent of the problem until I open you up and get in there and take a look at it. And it's kind of what we have to do as dog trainers as well. Sometimes we have to start the counter conditioning process. And if we make a lot of headway with that counter conditioning process, and we're pretty sure that the behavior has a large learned component, because now we're having an effect on it, right? If despite all our best efforts and doing the right things, we can't affect it very much, then maybe there's a much larger learned or genetic.
Right. And there is another. I hope Aishwarya, this was clear. I hope your question is answered. Okay, Dev, Anvay, all these people are saying hi to you, Jerry.
Oh, great.
Okay. Now, another very common question everyone asks is, when do they correct the dog? Do they correct the dog at the growl, or do they correct the dog at the bite? Because obviously you want the warning to remain, or or you correct the dog at the growl so that you never let the aggression progress. What's your take on this? Because this is a common thing pet parents ask. Like, what do we do at the first growl?
Well, again, whenever there's any type of aggression, I think it's essential that they seek professional help. Because if you misinterpret the behaviors that you're seeing, you can oftentimes make it. So I'm not a big believer in correcting aggression per se, right? So depending on what's going on, if let's take an example of you put the food down for your young dog, and he's eating, and then you start to approach the bowl, and for example, he growls at you. If you try and punish that behavior at that moment, oftentimes you can make the aggression worse, because the mode of your interaction, where you're saying no, you can't express that behavior, might make him dig in his heels even more. And so what I would look at is, if I was dealing with that behavior, I would say, okay, now that it's noticed and I see it happening, what can I do to counter condition that behavior, for example, right? So if a resource guarding problem is simple, like he only growls over one kind of toy, let's say a rawhide bone, for example, which is a real meat bone, then what I would say is just don't give him that, right? Remove the stimulus completely. If the behavior generalizes a little bit to certain types of toys or a food bowl or something like that, where we can't just remove the stimulus, then we have to think about doing some sort of counter conditioning, some sort of systematic desensitization. And so what I would do is I would put one, with the dog growls over a food bowl, instead of trying to punish it in the moment where the stimulus is still there. Now I'm saying, no, you can't show that growling behavior to me, and I'm going to cause some pain. What's going to end up happening is that might make that dog even worse with his aggression, because now I've made a confrontation over it. So instead, I might say, okay, next time I feed you, I'm going to put one kibble in the bowl and put it down. And he goes to eat it. And then all of a sudden, he's like, wait a minute, what happened? What happened to my food so fast? And then I would tell him, sit, put another piece of kibble in the bowl, let him eat it. Now, with the hand feeding process, he's starting to learn I'm in control of this kibble.
Nice.
It's not his particular resource to own or to guard. He gets the kibble because I'm allowing him to have it. And so I'll start hand feeding him at dinner time, showing him that what goes in the bowl is not his to guard. And if he eats it and he looks back at me and he gives me a nice behavior, then he's going to get some more. And then I'll experiment with putting 2 or 3 kibbles in the bowl at a time. And when there's no growling, he gets praised, he gets more kibbles. So he starts to learn that good behavior around the food bowl gets him something. And then as I start putting more kibbles in the bowl, I might approach his bowl with my hand with a piece of chicken. And then as I get close to the bowl, he realizes, wait a minute, when his hands come near my bowl, not only is he not taking it away, but he's bringing something better to the party, right? So
Right.
he's going to look forward to me coming to his bowl, right?
Right.
I would sometimes trade him something for his food bowl. So I give him maybe a nice piece of chicken, and I pick up the food bowl, and then I put the food bowl back down. So he
Nice.
starts to learn that my interaction around the food bowl is not trying to take away what he has. And so that takes away the reason for him to having to guard it, right? So there are approaches to these problems where sometimes correction actually makes them a lot worse. The same thing happens with, let's say, dog reactivity. If you take the
I
dog
was
out,
going to come to that. Yeah.
yeah, let's say he's scared or nervous, right? Fear in dogs is a lot of why we see aggression, not because they're necessarily dominant or they're wanting to, they're just wanting to be aggressive to us. Sometimes it's just fear, and that's how they communicate how they want to have space. And so, if we have a dog that wants to bark and maybe growl at the end of the leash at other dogs, if we correct at that same time and we show that dog that not only do you not like that other dog being around, maybe because you're scared of it, but now when that dog is around, I'm going to cause you pain on top of it by making a correction. That can make that problem worse, and it can exacerbate the aggression. So we have to think really, really hard about how we want to approach these problems. In my experience, most of the time when we have aggression cases, what we're trying to do is teach the dog that the aggression is unnecessary to express.
Right.
He's safe. He's secure. Nothing bad is going to happen to him when he goes out on the street and he sees other dogs or he sees other people coming near him. And there's not a good way to teach that with pressure and with correction necessarily. So um,
Right.
I think we have to be really careful about that. And then the other thing too is some of these behaviors that we're trying to mitigate or make better. Um, if we're not directly around to manage it and give correction, then how is that dog going to understand that in that instance that behavior is not okay to engage in, right? So I think we have to
Absolutely.
be thoughtful about how we try and do these things. I think sometimes when the question, as it was asked, for example, is when's the right time to do correction? Sometimes the answer is that's not the right way to frame the question. Because that way of framing the question presupposes that correction is the a proper approach. So we would have to say, let's think real hard about whether or not that's really a good approach to try and correct that behavior. And some of it depends on the type of aggression that we're talking about, right? if it's if it's constant, very forward, confident aggression that you might see, let's say in the dominance context, well, you might want to teach obedience behaviors that are incompatible with that expression of aggression behavior. And then if the dog decides not to do the obedience, then you can make corrections for the obedience, but not necessarily directly to the aggression.
Right, right, makes sense. Okay, so Richard here is asking a question. Richard, who's been competing with Yuki now in PSA,
Hmm.
he's asking a question: how to ensure conflict-free engagement communication while raising a puppy, working or non-working?
That's the goal all the time, right? Is to have good interactions that are conflict free. I aspire to have all my relationships, whether with friends, family, and my dogs, to be conflict free. But it's about managing those things, right?
Right.
So I think like we said before, when you start with a puppy, you're starting with that blank slate, right? And how you teach that dog to interact with you, to engage with you, is super important. And it's a little bit different whether we're dealing with a working dog, right? And we want that dog to maybe be pushy with us for engagement, or whether we're dealing with a pet dog. We want that dog to pay attention to us and not necessarily gain as much from its environment, let's say, right? So with a working dog, we want to create a dog that really looks to us in obedience and so forth. We want to create a dog that's not too independent, but also seeks things from us. On the other side of the coin, when we're dealing with a pet dog, we want to make sure that that pet dog doesn't only look at its environment, right? You see some owners come in and the only part of the dog that ever points to them is the back end, because the dog is always looking for reinforcement, or looking for any type of reward in its environment, right? Nose to the ground, other people, other dogs. So we would call that dog distracted, right? But really, what's happened is we didn't do a good enough job of teaching the dog that we're critically important, right? And so we want to balance that independence also with engagement with the dog. So I think how you go about doing that, is depends on the individual dog's temperament, right? So when I look at a puppy, if, for example, I see that puppy is maybe too interested in me as the owner, as the pet parent, well, that might predict some possibility of separation anxiety. If the dog needs to maybe learn more independence. So the types of training and exercises I would work on with that dog that tends to be maybe a little bit more into the owner is going to be different than that puppy that's super independent already. That one I'm going to have to work more on creating engagement with. That one I'm going to work maybe more obedience exercises with, where rewards come from me for doing things in its daily work. So I think you have to look at the individual temperament of the dog to decide what's going to be conflict free for that dog. We have to take stock of the temperament. This is something I teach to my students at our academy here, is before you start talking about what you're going to do, you have to understand the dog that's in front of you. We have to evaluate that particular dog's temperament, right? So what are we looking at when we look at temperament? Well, we're looking at the drives that the dog has, what motivates that dog, right? Whether it's play, prey, food, toys, what is it that motivates that dog? What are the dog's nerves like? How does that dog interact in its environment? Is it skittish? Is it scared? Is it fearful? Is it neutral? Is it confident, right? So we're looking at that. And then also, one of the big things that we evaluate when I look at a dog is that dog very handler dependent, or is that dog very independent, right? And oftentimes with pet dogs, when they come to us, you can see very quickly that the dog is either overly dependent on the handler or doesn't see the handler as a big consequence in their life at all.
Right.
And based on that evaluation, then we can say, okay, we have to, garner more dependency on the handler, or we got to create more independence, let's say. So it depends on the dog. It depends on the puppy, young adult, what their interaction with their environment looks like temperament wise. Then we can say what we need to do more of and maybe what we need to do less of.
Right. And his follow-up question was that how do you build aggression in a dog without conflict?
Well, same thing. If we're looking at building aggression in a dog, one of the things that we want to do when we're doing, let's say, sport or training a police dog or so forth, is where does the conflict come from when we're training? The conflict almost always comes from the handler's intervention in the process, right? So we have to ask ourselves, how are we intervening in that process when we're trying to build aggression in a dog? There are two types of ways that we build aggression. We tend to not want to build aggression in a pet dog, right? We want to eliminate aggression for the most part, or but when we're doing, let's say, sport dogs, or we're doing a police dog or something like that, where the aggression has to be created, but yet maintain control of that aggression. Then we have to think about what drives does the dog have. If we look at that puppy or young adult and say, well, he's got tons of prey drive, not so, maybe his defense drive is not matured yet, then we work the strongest drive first. So it would be, I would work on that dog's prey drive, let's say, if he evaluated as being prey heavy versus being defense heavy, and then start building confidence in his expression of that drive. And then through the process of drive channeling, where we start to tap into the dog's other drive, which would be his defense drive, and we can start bringing that into the process. And I think as we build aggression in our young sport dogs, we're looking to teach that dog that the expression of that aggression gets him something, right? So either when we're doing prey work, if we start building his prey aggression and tapping into it and tapping into the control of it, he's going to learn that the expression of that aggression gets him things, right? It might get him to the opportunity to bite his toy, to bite the wedge, to bite the sleeve, whatever the case may be. Um, and then as we start bringing in pressure, where they have to learn how to bite under pressure, it's like a police dog would or a sport dog does, then they start to understand through that process of drive channeling that they control their environment, right? They control with their expression of their aggression, they control the environment. And then, of course, we as trainers, we start to put obedience on that to where we can say, here are the circumstances under which you can now express that aggression. And here are the circumstances under which you cannot express that aggression. And so I think taking things slowly, taking it step by step, having a good program to follow, right? Richard's question is probably best answered by reading an entire book, right? So how do you build conflict-free aggression? Well, you have to start at the beginning, build a good foundation, and then start adding the skills in the proper way where the dog understands when it can, when it can't express aggression and so forth. But it's a long process to actually answer a question like that. It's a very open-ended one. But I would say I'll take this opportunity to say my podcast, the Controlled Aggression Podcast, has many episodes where we talk about building from the ground up aggression in sport dogs, police dogs, and how to do that and still maintain a good relationship with the dog and maintain a good relationship with the dog's environment, right? We don't want to create dogs that are dangerous. We don't want to create dogs that show aggression inappropriately when we're building it, right? We have to build it carefully and under good supervision from well-versed trainers.
Correct. Richard, I hope that helped. Yeah. Now I have something to ask you. So like India doesn't have a real sport culture, right? Like the only
Right.
sport we have is PSA.
Mhm.
Thanks to you and your continuous support to all of us here, that at least we have one sport. Would you like to say something to the pet owners about sports in general? Is that going to help solve a lot of aggression issues as well? Because the dogs are going to be doing something. Also, there is this entire myth that exists, is that sports are only for experts, only for trainers.
Mhm.
There are There are a few hobbies who are also competing, but it's mainly the trainers.
Yeah.
So, would you like to say something to the pet owners about sports in general and PSA as well?
Yeah, 100%. I think obviously there's sort of the grouping of the bite sports, right? Um, IPO, we have PSA, French ring, Mondio ring. There are all these different sports that involve an aspect of protection work to them. Um, but those are not the only sports, right? There are so many sports out there, from dock diving, which virtually any dog can compete in, to agility, obedience in and of itself is a sport, right? So there's so many sports out there that people can engage in. And I think the bigger question is when you get a dog, I think, maybe a lot of the Indian parents would understand that one of the things you do with your children is find out what their proclivities are in terms of, are they musical, are they sports oriented, and then help to foster those interests, right? Of course, everybody goes to school, has to get a great education, but there's so many other things, sports wise, and activity wise, that we want our kids to engage in to make them well-rounded human beings. And it's really no different for the pet owners out there. Your dogs are generally wanting to engage in activity, right? I think lack of exercise and lack of mental stimulation are two of the things that cause so many of the behavioral problems that we see. As maybe, I don't know if this is a saying over in India, but we have a saying here in the United States that idle hands are the devil's workshop, basically. So when kids are not given enough ways to occupy themselves and to express themselves, and we expect them to be good, lots of times that's when they're most mischievous, right? Same thing with your dogs. They're going to look for ways to satisfy their innate drives. And if we can give them structured ways to do that, the bite sports are a great way to take a dog that maybe has a little bit of natural prey aggression and even defensive aggression, and shape it in a way where we create a dog that's confident, that learns that only in these certain situations can you express aggression, not in your normal daily life. That you can use the sports to your advantage. But more than that, I know my dogs, for example, are very social. My sport dogs are very social dogs. They love people, but they love to work, and they live for the time where they can get out, run, jump, use their brains, right, to learn things, from obedience to agility to the control portions of the bike sport that we do. But to them, they just want to work. And many, many, many dogs don't get the opportunity to express themselves that way. And I think it's the reason why we see a lot of problems. A lot of the destructive problems that we see is because dogs don't get an opportunity, to really get tired, right? Exercise is super important. I think sometimes we feel like just a quick walk around the block is sufficient exercise for a young adolescent dog, and oftentimes it's not. So, get those dogs obedience training, and then start to look at what sports are available. And I think a lot of dog trainers like yourself are finding ways in which to give owners ways that they can interact over sports, right? So, coming and taking a class on agility, or taking a class on dock living, or taking a class on nose work. I think trainers in India are going to be doing much, much, much more of that stuff. Not just the bite sports, but sports in general, I think, are really healthy. And then it gives you another level, for dog owners and pet parents, over which you can interact with your dog, because most of these sports are participation by both the owner and the dog, right? It's not just the dog going out and doing things, right? You're right there with them, and so it gives you a way in which to bond with your dog, that I think gives you another level of interaction with your dog. So if you really like spending time with your dog, finding an activity that you can do, even something as simple as so I have a friend who has a dog training place here in Sanford. She does classes. She does canine acting classes, right? Where They teach the dogs different types of behaviors that might be useful if they're on a movie set, for example. Turning off light switches, getting something out of the refrigerator, going to the mailbox and putting a letter in the mailbox, right? And they break those behaviors down, and that's a mental stimulation, right? So any type of mental or physical stimulation from even something as simple as tracking, can be a way to teach your dog how to concentrate on an activity. And then we have a saying here too: a tired dog is a good dog, right?
Right.
So if they've had a full day, just like your kids, if they had a full day, they eat dinner, get done with their homework, and they're actually physically tired, then they're probably not going to give you a lot of trouble when it comes to bedtime. Same thing with your dogs. If they're physically tired, you've had a long day, they've had some exercise. A lot of times, the interactions in the evening are much easier for you when they're a little bit tired. So a tired dog is a good dog. Think of ways in which you can use these sports to your advantage for sure.
Right. Right. Okay, let's take one more question from the audience. Sanya is asking, how do you strike the right balance of inward and outward focus in a sport prospect or a green dog?
I actually did a podcast on this, I think last year, which might be worth Sonia taking another look at. But I think really, as you start working with the dog, what you're going to do is you're going to see things, right? So, for example, I had a student had this German Shepherd puppy that was a little bit handler dependent, but he did probably way too much motivational obedience training with the dog when it was young, and he created lots of inward focus where whenever you train a reward-based training method, you create a reward history. So the dog starts to learn, what is it in my environment that produces rewards? And when the dog starts to realize that the rewards come from my handler, and attentiveness to my handler, and being around my handler, no matter what the environment, produces tons of rewards, then basically what you might be seeing is you're creating too much neutrality to the environment, where you're taking away some of that dog's outward focus, where it's curious about exploring the environment, right? Whereas with another dog, if you don't do a lot of that stuff early on, they might think, well, you're boring, so my environment provides me with much more entertainment than you do. And so you create a little bit too much outward focus in a puppy like that, right? Um, this is often the problem that we see with pet dogs, where the owners are not creating enough reward history around them. And then the dog thinks that everything else is much more exciting. Other dogs, other people, putting my nose on the ground will sometimes produce the odd reward. So they're very outwardly focused. And then they come to us as trainers and they're saying, well, we're struggling with getting this dog to pay attention to us. He's always so distracted, right? That's because as a pup, you probably didn't create enough reward history where the puppy thought you were important, right? And so we want to kind of balance that out a little bit, where when you have a sport prospect, you want the dog to be attentive to you because you need to create a good rapport and good obedience training with that dog. But at the same time, we want the dog to be able to outwardly focus a little bit too, so that it pays attention to the decoy. It'll be able to focus on tasks that are outside of the handler dog relationship a little bit, right? And that would be protection work, where the dog has to be fully focused on the decoy and so forth. So I think as you raise that puppy, you have to make adjustments, right? And so if you see, I'm creating a little bit too much inward focus, when I go out to my training field with my club or my training group, and the dog doesn't want to pay attention to the decoy, doesn't want to pay attention to the rag, even though it has a lot of prey drive, then you might be saying, well, maybe I play too much with it. So, like, for example, one of the things that I'll tell people is, once you start going to club and you want the dog to interact with the club decoys in your sport training, stop doing it at home, right?
Hmm.
You don't want the dog to get 20 sessions a week at home doing bite work with you, and then 2 or 3 sessions with somebody else, because the dog might decide, I'd rather do it with you because I already have a great relationship with you. You're already the source of a lot of reward. So that would be how we can train some independence into the dog. So I think we have to be really careful, that we have to constantly take stock of how the progression is going with that puppy. Because you may start out with a puppy that's very outwardly focused and you do a lot of obedience for a few weeks. And in those early months with that puppy, it's very, very malleable, right? Those puppies shape very quickly. They learn the lessons that we're teaching them very well. Puppies are so receptive. And so you might take a dog that started out being a little bit outwardly focused and through your interventions make them very inwardly focused. And then you might have to slow down a little bit, right, with what you're doing and make a little bit of adjustment to your training plan. And then you might, see the same thing. Maybe you start out and you're trying to create more independence in the dog. And then you start to say, oh, if I don't start, getting a little bit more important in this dog's world, I'm going to, lose the ability to really intervene with this dog. And so you would say, okay, I got to dial a little bit of that independence training back, do more, right, of creating inward focus with this particular dog, create more of a reward history through me, right? And so a lot of it is just that constant, like taking stock of where the dog is in its progression. And when you're starting with a puppy, that's every week to week thing. You're sort of seeing, is what I'm doing having an effect, and what's the intensity of that effect that I'm having. And then you can start to say, okay, now I have to make some slight adjustments in my plan with the dog. And that really is the life of a sport dog trainer, right? You're constantly making those adjustments all the way through your dog's entire career. We have a tendency when we're doing things to maybe overcorrect a little bit, and then we have to, sort of walk things back sometimes. And then, we start to strike that balance over time, with our interactions on the whole. So I think the other thing I would say too is like, don't be nervous if at first you started to see, I did too much motivational obedience. I created too much handler dependence. You can always sort of walk that stuff back over time. You might struggle with it a little bit, but you can still create independence in the dog. And the same thing is the other way. If you create a little bit too much independence early on, you can still, work on that dependency a little bit later on if you need to. But take stock. And this is where having a good club and good training directors come in, right? Where people can watch you and say, hey, maybe you need to adjust your program a little bit. And you as the owner, it's just like everything else, right? If any of your pet parents write for a living, whether it's reports or anything, the more you read your own work, and you might skip over a typographical error 1,000 times. Then I hand it to you, and you look at it and you say, "Oh, you forgot the apostrophe on this particular word, right?" And immediately you're like, "How did I read that 100 times and miss it?" Sometimes you get too close when you're training a puppy or a young dog. You get too close to the process and you miss things. Whereas outside eyes, and this is why we have spotters in obedience, we have training directors and decoys. We all interact with each other over the creation of this process. And if you have good people working with you, then they can spot where the mistakes are coming in. That's the same thing with pet dogs, right? You have somebody come to you, how they describe a problem to you might be much different than what you see when they come, right? Because they might be missing some things in the relationship with their dog.
Right. Great. Great. Yeah, from what you just said right now, right, that to have a good club, to have a good team to work with, that
Mm-hmm.
is what will make a lot of difference for a
Sure.
sport. But what if there is someone who cannot travel or who doesn't have access to a decoy?
Mm-hmm.
What would you suggest? Can they still work their dogs on their own, or it doesn't really make sense for the handler to be decoying as well? Or do they still need to at least catch a decoy once in a few weeks or months? Or, how is it? How can they work? Because what if they still
Yeah.
want to participate but they don't have access to a club? So, what
Yeah.
could they?
I think I think it's a tough situation when those sports depend so heavily on the decoys, right? Because we use decoys in obedience training, we use decoys obviously in the protection piece, and it's important for the dogs to get that interaction from somebody who's not the handler. However, early on, if necessary, sometimes, when working the dog, let's say in prey drive, for example, yes, you can do a lot with that young dog in the beginning. And again, it really depends on that dog's temperament, whether or not that's going to pay off in the long run or create more problems in the long run. Um, and it's tough when you don't have a lot of decoys. I think one of the things that you're seeing more and more is when I go on Facebook, for example, and I see my friends from India posting pictures and training. You see a lot of the original people that started doing PSA. Now they've got their wives and girlfriends putting on the suit, right? And then vice versa. Some of the women that started in now they're getting their boyfriends and their husbands and just
Right.
their friends in general to pitch in a little bit, right?
Right.
And to learn the techniques. And I think one of the things that you see happening is more and more people are learning how to be decoys. I think that's one of the things. One of the solution strategies is make more decoys, right? If
Right.
I think you may have not as much access to, let's say, highly skilled trial level decoys early, in your dog's career. That's fine. It happens for all of us, even here in the States. Some people live in places where they don't have ready access to decoys all the time. But if you take the time to develop people in your club, give them opportunities to learn how to be better decoys,
Right.
then they can start contributing at whatever level that they can. Right. Just yesterday we had a club and a few of our club decoys were out of town, and so my trainer Ben and I got together, and some of our new students got together, and they all pitched in. They put on the suits. There were distractions, things of that nature, and we did what we could in that situation where we didn't have a lot of decoys. So we managed to work with what we had in that situation.
Right.
I think that's a lot of it is just sort of working with what you have. It is important to get your dogs on other people. It is important to have other decoys work your dog, but you have to do what you have to do, right? And if you're really passionate about doing the sport, then you do the best that you can with the resources that you have available. But again, make more decoys. I think that's really important. Don't just don't assume that people can't do it. I think that happens a lot too, where people are just like, well, I don't have access to any decoys. Well, you're not, if you're not a hermit, you're not living by yourself. It's not just you and the dogs. There are other people around you. Take the time to teach them what to do. And sometimes that'll spark a passion in that person where they might not have realized, oh, I really enjoy decoying for the dogs. I like working them. Working from that side of the dog is also very interesting, right? When you're the one who's you're the mechanism for operant conditioning for that animal, right? You're the reward, and so being in that position teaches you a lot about how that dog learns. And
Right.
so I think once you do it, it can become a passion. Some people obviously don't like it. They don't like getting, being the one in the suit. They don't like getting bit. But sometimes for those people, if they don't like suit bites, maybe it's a little too personal, maybe it hurts a little too much, you can do stuff with sleeves. You can do stuff with the rag with puppies, right? So try and develop your people. I think that's really really important. Don't assume people can't do it. Just try your best to share that skill and share that knowledge.
Absolutely. Great. Yeah, I think that is what we all need to do.
Hmm.
Right. Uh, Talking about defense, Jerry, you just
Yeah.
said prey work, probably some of it we could still do on our own. So, how early do we start defense work with a puppy or with an older dog who's never done bite work before?
Hmm.
You'll obviously be spending probably some months in prey work. So, what would be the right age or what would be the right time to start the defense works?
That's a question I get a lot, and it's a really tough one, right? Because it's really not age is not the functional variable there, right? It's more that particular dog and how receptive they are to manipulating that particular drive. So I usually try and keep at it a little bit early with the dogs, like through prey guarding, things of that nature. To see, how if you start to tap into that defense and kind of a low stakes confrontation, over a sleeve or over a ledge or something like that, and start teaching a little bit of guarding of prey. Um, if the dog is receptive to it, then we can slowly start adding that into our repertoire. If the dog is not receptive to it, I don't want to overly stress the immature dog with pressure, where the dog feels like he's being threatened. Right? We have to remember what the triggers are, both for prey and defense. The trigger for prey is movement. The trigger for defense is threat. How much threat we want that young dog to experience depends on the particular temperament of that dog. and how well we can offload the stress. That requires prey work. So if we can offload the stress fairly readily, and we can put a little stress on because we can take it off. If the dog is not really working well in prey, um, we may have to tap into defense, right, to just get any sort of action or reaction out of the dog. But then we have to be very careful, right? We have to be careful that we don't overload the dog with stress. We don't want to create a bad feeling about what the dog is engaging in, right? So that becomes important. So really, it depends on the dog at hand. I would look at each dog very differently. Some dogs, I wait till much later to bring defense work in. If the nerves are a little thin in the dog, you have to be a little careful about that too, that you don't create any sort of avoidance situations. But usually when if the dog starts in prey work, usually by about 7 to 12 months, I'm taking a look at how they react in defense. If the dog gives me no reaction whatsoever, then we just move on, keep doing what we're doing in prey. And every once in a while, we sort of peek back in to see. Even dogs that are high prey eventually will come to defense a little bit. Some dogs have to be stimulated a little bit more actively than others, but we have to look at each dog differently. So it's a really hard question to ask or to answer in that sense that every dog's going to look differently. I see sometimes where people are on Facebook saying, "Don't ever do defense work with puppies." And if that aggression is there, if it's present, if the dog is willing to express it, even as a younger puppy, we have to do it in a very careful, well thought out way, right? But yeah, I can start making that dog realize that if he shows me a little bit of aggression, he's going to manipulate me, right? That's sort of the opposite of what we're teaching our pet dogs, right? Which is we don't want them to learn that aggression can manipulate us, right? But when we're doing it in the sport context, we're doing it in a very controlled way, in very particular circumstances, right? We don't want that to be a general message to our dog. That would be counterproductive. But we're doing it in a very specific context where they learn when they're threatened, if they threaten back, they're going to control the situation. That builds confidence in the dog, right? I usually tell people it's like when you have a young kid in martial arts, for example, 6, 7, 8-year-old kids can do martial arts. But we're not teaching them like real street fighting at that age, right? That's kind of prey work for the young kid when they're learning, the moves, and they're learning the methods that we want them to learn, the techniques we want them to learn. But it's not serious just yet, right? As that young child turns into an adolescent and a teenager and so forth, then we can start thinking about, okay, now you have to learn to apply this knowledge in a way where you can defend yourself, let's say. And so we can spar with them a little bit. They can learn what it's like to get hit, to get kicked, and things like that, right? So same thing with our dogs. We want them to basically, as puppies, learn the mechanics, learn how to spar, sort of do it in a way where there's safety and they don't feel threatened existentially. Then we can start making it a little more serious as time goes on, because obviously they have to learn that they can handle themselves in those situations, right? So yeah, it's a tough thing, and each dog is different. Each dog's training program is going to be a little bit different. And that's something I talk about in my book, Controlled Aggression, where we start with the foundation work, and before we get to the skills. And a lot of the work in the foundation stage of training really depends on each individual dog and how we're evaluating them over time.
Right. Jerry, coming to the last question from me, we do have two questions from the audience. If you have the time, that is, we'll take
Sure.
those. Like you said, we really don't teach civil very soon, right? You're first going to just teach the skills, and then there's going to be a real fight. So when do we really do the civil work? One, and two, I've heard some people say that some dogs are only sport dogs and they are not real dogs, but I don't think that really works, because like I've seen in our PDC, right, you're one of the scenarios where it's a carjacking scenario,
Mhm.
and a lot of, obviously, because it's a civil, a lot of dogs do end up failing in that scenario. So is there really, like, what would you like to say about that? Like, how important is it to do that, when and how, all of that?
Well, I think the question kind of gets at the idea that when we do an evaluation of a dog, every dog is going to be different, right? They're going to have, I look at prey, intensity, and defense intensity, how those drives interact early on in the evaluation. And you're going to have dogs that are more prey heavy. You're going to have dogs that are more defense heavy. Um, a lot of times, the dogs that are more defense heavy early on when they're young dogs, those dogs might be a little thin in the nerve. And so you have to be a little bit careful. But at the same time, to make a well-rounded dog, a dog needs to understand how to function in prey and how to function in defense. All dogs do. You will run across the occasional dog that we refer to in kind of in the colloquial sense as a dog trainer as a prey monster. Like it's really difficult to tap into their defensive side because they basically see the world through prey eyes. And so you might find with a dog like that he doesn't really see threat. Even when you threaten him, he doesn't perceive threat, right? And defense is all about perception of threat. They have to perceive a threat in order for them to realize that it's a threat, right? So what one dog perceives as a threat, another dog might not. And so um, really, if all we do is play training with that dog, and he never realizes that threat can happen. And this, we kind of get back to our earlier question about if you're doing all the work on your dog, decoying and so forth. Sometimes those dogs won't perceive threat because they already have a relationship with you. They feel confident that you're not going to hurt them, and so you're just providing an opportunity for them to do something they like, which is bite and prey. That way, the dog never really learns that decoy can be threatening, right? And then when it happens, when you go to a trial and all of a sudden now you have somebody threatening, the dog's like, I don't know what that means. I've never been shown that picture. That's where you can get some of those failures that you were talking about. Um, so I think it's important as we're building those young dogs to take the time to build in some civil aggression. Let them understand that they can manipulate the world if they feel threatened. They can solve that problem. They have the resources and the tools to solve that problem. And sometimes I think that's where you get those failures, where all of a sudden the dog is now confronted with somebody, maybe not their normal club decoy or something like that, and they don't know how to deal with that, right? So that's a bit of an issue. So I think as you're going through the process of developing a protection dog, whether it's a sport dog, a police dog, a personal protection dog, whatever it might be, it's important to deal with both sides of the dog. With what I say is like the prey side and the defense side. Um, you can do too much prey work with the dog. You can also do a lot too much defense work. Um, but the key for me has always been, and I've preached this in every seminar I've done when I've come to India, my book, my podcast, the interaction of the drives is so key. And I think that's something that doesn't get enough treatment. Teaching that dog to go back and forth between prey and defense and be able to manage its drives, understand how to deal with its environment when it's presented with a prey problem, how to deal with its environment when it's presented with a defense problem. Those are key things. So when people are training their dogs for competition, they have to understand both sides of the dog. And that means that they have to understand the temperament of the dog that they're dealing with. And as that dog matures, they're going to, the typical maturation process will be as that dog becomes adolescent and grows into adulthood, they're going to look for more threats in their environment, right? So naturally, as time goes by, you'll start to see moments where the dog starts to show a little bit more natural defensive aggression. And then once you start seeing that, you got to pick up on that as the trainer and say, okay, now let's start to manipulate that. Let's start to build some confidence in that dog's defense. So that's something that usually, as we approach a year of age, I hate to say any particular age, but as you approach a year or so, then you're going to see a little bit more maturation into defense, and that's where you're going to probably mess with that a little bit more in your training.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that, Jerry. Now, Dave has a question. Hey, Jerry, we have a young dog in our club that's really amazing in biting a pillow or a sleeve, Tom. Isn't pressurized easily, really calm grips, just refuses to bite the suit. The few time he does, he isn't pressured at all. Seems very comfortable biting in the arm. What do you think might be the reason? How can we make it better?
Yeah. So um, leave it to Deb to write the longest question of the day, right? Uh, so I think a couple of different things, right? It could be that the dog has, depending on what their age is, that the dog has just developed a um, preference for biting the jute. I've seen this happen a few times where you start, you're doing a bite pillow, get the bite on the sleeve, you spend a lot of time on the sleeve. And then all of a sudden now you introduce another texture to the dog, the bite suit. So I guess the first question I would ask Dev is if he went from the chomp, let's say, to a Belgian arm, where the dog started to learn targeting in the in the bicep or the tricep, now with a little bit of a different texture, with let's say a synthetic sleeve. Because I've seen dogs create. It's not so much they don't want to bite the suit, but we've created a preference in them in biting a particular material. And then as soon as we introduce a different material to the dog, they don't like it, right? Um, if the dog is pretty free in temperament and doesn't really feel like he says pressured when it's biting, I think we have to look back and see if this really isn't just a texture problem. So I would say get a sleeve that's made of suit material and see if that dog would engage that in the sort of on the forearm first and see how the dog reacts to that. Um, if it's sometimes without seeing the dog it's hard to say if the dog is just not understanding what we want it to do, right? Biting somebody in a bite suit is a little bit more personal to some dogs, so some dogs also don't like biting where they feel the person underneath, right? They may have some natural bite inhibition, and as soon as they feel the person underneath they feel like they're doing something wrong, so sometimes we don't get good contact there. So that's a tough question to ask or to answer without actually seeing, the dog and seeing how they're behaving as we, transition. But I think sometimes it's just that texture problem. So that's why, as a puppy, we want to teach them, to play with bite the leather rag, bite the cloth rag, bite the synthetic, puppy sleeve. Start generalizing their biting behavior to different textures. We see this all the time too when we're doing hidden sleeve work, where a certain type of texture on a hidden sleeve, when we use a cover on a hidden sleeve, can bother certain dogs. If it's too slippery or too slick versus coarseness, things like that. So that may be the problem. It's really hard to say without being able to see. The other thing too is if you try and go to the suit and the dog doesn't want to do it, then you go back to the sleeve. You may be teaching the dog that if he doesn't get what he wants, that you'll provide what he wants in the next session, right? So I would maybe frustrate the dog a whole lot, and maybe this is the point in the dog's career where if he's going on the suit, maybe you need to start doing a little bit more defense work with the dog instead of trying to get him to engage necessarily in prey. Make it a little bit more of a serious confrontation for the dog, so that maybe he wants to do that.
Okay, Dave, I think that helps. We have one more question from Chandra. When is the right time to introduce scenarios to a dog in protection?
I mean, we're showing them different scenarios and pictures all the time, and their run up in their foundation work. But you have to look. I think the key is like look at what the scenarios require, right? And then ask yourself, did I provide the proper foundation? And then what skills are required to execute such a scenario? And then make sure you have those skills compartmentalized, right, and trained in the dog. Then you can say, now I can start to put those skills together in the scenario. I think people rush into scenario training before they're completely finished with their foundation and the key skills that they need, right? Like, for example, in the level one, the send through a tunnel to a passive bite, right? That's one of the, it seems like one of the easier scenarios, but a passive bite is not always so easy. But I think a lot of times what happens is when we're doing our decoy work for our dogs, maybe we're starting the action as decoys instead of letting the dog start the action. So the dog looks at decoys and expects movement. Then all of a sudden you try and get them to engage somebody passive and the dog doesn't understand the context, right? So I think you have to ask yourself, okay, in that particular scenario, my dog has to understand a tunnel, understand how to go through a tunnel at a distance, understand when he comes out of the tunnel to bite somebody in a suit that's not moving. So you have to have all your bite foundation done. You have to have the dog understands targeting, where to bite in the suit, what's going to be presented to that dog, right? If the dog doesn't understand how to bite passively without an active presentation, you're going to have trouble in that scenario. So you have to break down the little pieces, right? And then you can say, all right, now is the time to start scenario training.
Right.
On the PSA website, I believe, as well as I have it posted on my Patreon account for my podcast. If anybody's a patron of the podcast, patreon.com/controlled aggression. There's a booklet that I published on there that has how to train the 5 surprise scenarios for the level 1. So you
Okay.
can actually, and it breaks everything down. It says what are the key component skills, what do you need to develop in order to put the scenario together. And I think if you approach your scenarios that way,
Right.
it's the right time is when you have the components individually trained well enough that you can put the components together in a scenario.
Right.
And so I always preach component training, right? That you don't know in PSA what your scenario might look like. What you can know are what the skills are that are involved in that scenario.
Right.
Then you have to be creative in terms of being a trainer, where you say, okay, now I have to start putting together these individual skills in different ways and try and anticipate maybe what a judge might ask in a level 2 scenario, right? And then it gets even worse. I'm competing at the level 3 with my dog, trying to anticipate what a judge might do in the level 3.
Right.
That's where looking at old film, seeing what some of the judges like to do. You maybe watch some video of a particular judge. Like people sometimes when they watch video of PSA trials, they're watching the dog and the handler. They forget they have to think about, well, that judge that I might see, down the road. If
Right.
Jonathan Katz is my judge, what does he like to do? What are his biases when he's judging? What does he like to see teams do? And so you have to consider also what is that judge doing? What scenarios are they asking for in the level 2? Because I think Chandra's at a level 2 with one of his dogs. What's he doing at level 2? What's Jerry like to see at level 2? Right. So when you start thinking about the judges, you start thinking about, okay, what are some of their proclivities? So
Right.
as a sport competitor in PSA, we're thinking not just in terms of what's possible, but maybe what that judge, might see. So they have a history of writing scenarios too. So that's something to think about. But yeah, training the component skills is key. We train good component skills, and we can put those things together.
Right. Perfect. Chandra, I hope that helped. Jerry, we are going to take the last question. We've almost covered this, though, if you want to add a little bit to this. Kashi, he's a hobbyist. He's been working his
Mhm.
dogs for PSA as well. Is there a roadmap to training a puppy for PSA sport? As in, what behaviors are taught in a chronological manner so as to avoid conflicts in training? You've pretty much said quite a bit about it, but
Right.
if you would like to add, something.
Yeah. Well, like this is again, this is a good question because when you don't have like a big long sport culture in a country like India, if he was in the United States, I would say, well, go to a good club where you have a training director who's done it before. Then they can
Right,
guide you, right?
right,
When you're trying to do all this stuff on your own, I think again you have to be creative in understanding what is the temperament of my particular dog, my puppy. So is the book hasn't yet been written on start to finish training a dog for PSA sport, right? Maybe that's a book that I'll write eventually, or somebody else in PSA will write. But I think if you sort of look at least on the protection side, if you look at my book Controlled Aggression and the podcasts that I do that sort of flesh out each of those chapters in my podcast, that's kind of it, right? The chronological order of training and bite work is, evaluate your dog. If it's prey heavy, start working in prey. Set your goals for your prey sessions. Understand, what you're trying to develop in terms of, grip and pushing and intensity and so forth and so on. And then start bringing the prey dog to defense, and then drive channeling and targeting and so forth. And all that, gives you a rough order of operation to what you're doing. A lot of times, if people tend to be very logical in their thinking, I think sometimes you have to realize that there's not necessarily a formula. I set that aside differently than a roadmap. A roadmap is, generally, okay, here's how you get from point A to point B. But each dog is going to be a little different, right? You have to, when you look at your roadmap, you have to take into consideration that, you might have some detours along the way, right? You might have roadblocks or things like that, to keep that analogy
What kind of vehicle you're using, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, the resources that you have available to you. So you have to really kind of get the big picture. And this is something I stress all the time with my trainers at my academy and the people that I work with at the club, is you have to have a big picture in mind. That's your roadmap. But how each particular dog and puppy runs through that roadmap is going to be different. There's going to be different orders of things based on the temperament of the dog. And so that's something that I think they really have to pay attention to when they're doing it. So as they go on, I think watching what other people are doing, looking at videos, things like that are going to help you. But get a good big picture in your mind. The same thing is true with the obedience side of the dog. You want to be careful not to create too much inward focus, to create problems of independence. But at the same time, you have to develop the healing behaviors, all your obedience behaviors. The rate at which you develop those behaviors is going to depend on the temperament, right? Sometimes you might start building certain types of behaviors, then you set it aside and leave it alone for a little while, let the dog mature some, right? I think everybody thinks when they start something, they have to finish it right immediately, right? And it's not necessary, right? You can start to develop certain behaviors, and then in that progression, maybe work on something else for a little while based on how that dog seems to be reacting to the training. So that's a tough question to ask. I find sometimes the PSA trainers in India, they ask you a question, and my answer is that would take an entire book to explain, right? But yeah, the protection side is pretty well laid out in my book, Controlled Aggression. And then, find a good, find like I like this book. It was written by some IPO people that do IPO sport, called Successful Together. I don't know if you have access to that in India, right? But it's a very good book on, how to sort of develop a dog's obedience side. And again, how do you, as that dog gains maturity, you ask more of the dog, right? I think you have to be careful not to ask too much in the beginning, but also you want to also challenge your puppy, right, to keep the obedience training interesting. So I think what I always tell people is, whatever you do, whatever roadmap you find one that makes sense and stick to it. Don't bounce around. Don't keep changing methodologies and so forth. Right. So try and find a methodology you can kind of stick with and work your dog through the process. That's the fairest thing you can do for your dog.
Right. Great. Tashi, I'm sure that was helpful. Dave is saying that's really helpful. Thanks a ton, Jerry.
Mhm.
Chandra is saying now keep an eye on judges. Never did that before. Important skill for us to learn.
Good.
Okay. So with that, Jerry, let's come to the end of our chat. Thank you very much again. We have really extended our time as well, and really, really thank you for adjusting so much for us.
My
And I
pleasure.
hope it has helped everyone, pet parents and sport competitors. I hope it has helped everyone.
Good.
And I hope to see you soon, Jerry. You can also, if you have anything to say, please.
Yeah, I would say for there's a lot of resources out there. The PSA website has lots of resources on it. I think sometimes people only go there to see trials and get the rule book and things like that. But there are good links to videos, that people can download there. Also, my podcast. I deal with a lot of these topics in depth on the podcast. There's now we just hit our 2 year anniversary on the podcast. They can go to www.controlled.aggressionpodcast.com. You can stream right from there, but also you can go on your Apple or your Google Play and stream my podcast from there. Tons and tons of different topics that we deal with there. A lot of PSA stuff on there as well. A lot of stuff I've done recently in the last 6 months on aggression, in particular, different types of aggression and how to deal with those situations. And then there's lots of free resources on my business website, tarheelcanine.com/media. They can go to the media area on my website. I probably have about 60 or 70 articles on there from, sports stuff to police dog, and then some, just basic development work. So, and if anybody has the opportunity to become a patron of the podcast, if you go on patreon.com/controlled aggression, you can become a patron for as little as $5 a month. I post videos on there to flesh out a lot of the stuff that's in the podcast. There's other information on there on hard surface tracking, obedience, muzzle deconditioning, things of that nature. So there's a lot of extra resources there as well that people can avail themselves of. So it's my pleasure to get the opportunity to be on with you. Watching you grow as a trainer has been exciting for me. A few years ago, we had some conversations about how you were going to build your business, and you've really done a great job of getting out there and doing it. And so I want to say, as somebody who came to my seminars in India early, I'm very proud of you to see what you created and what you've done. And I think you create a great model for other people that are looking to build their businesses in India. You saw the opportunity, and now you're doing it. And so congratulations on that. And it's been an honor for me to be able to be on with you today, and hopefully maybe we can do it again in the future at some point.
Sure. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Yes. Bye, everyone.